Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and extract the critical insights you need to be well-informed. Today, we're undertaking a deep dive based on some really fascinating material you've shared with us. We're focusing on an event that, well, it stands at the very heart of Western history and culture, the death of Jesus Christ by crucifixion.
Yeah, it's a topic that's generated centuries of discussion, hasn't it? And this source you sent over gives an incredible survey of contemporary critical scholarship on it.
It really does. It
Yeah.
digs into what leading researchers today, and we're talking across the entire academic spectrum here, from highly skeptical folks to more conservative scholars, what they're actually saying about the historical evidence.
Right, the evidence for the crucifixion itself, the timing, when it likely happened.
The brutal physical reality of how he died, the really complex reasons why it happened, and even the scholarly debate around its potential significance. It covers a lot of ground.
It does. And the source strategically frames this, especially the historical fact of the death, within what's known as the minimal facts methodology.
Okay, can you unpack that a bit? Minimal facts methodology.
Sure. It's an approach that, well, first it tries to establish historical events that are backed up by multiple independent lines of evidence. Think different sources, different types of arguments.
Got it. Multiple lines of evidence.
Exactly. And then it looks at the degree to which a really vast majority of critical scholars agree on those specific points. And crucially, this includes scholars who might strongly disagree on other things, maybe theological interpretations or other historical details.
So it's about finding those core historical points where even the critics converge.
Precisely. It seeks out that bedrock of consensus among the experts, regardless of their broader viewpoints.
And the goal of this deep dive, using only the material you've provided, is to help us, and hopefully help you, navigate this pretty dense landscape of scholarly opinion.
Yeah, cut through some of the noise, maybe.
Exactly. Understand where the broad consensus lies. Explore the points where there's still sharp disagreement.
And maybe understand why those disagreements exist according to the scholars themselves. That's often the most interesting part.
Definitely. It's about getting a clearer view of the scholarly lay of the land, so to speak, on this really pivotal historical and theological event.
So our mission today, just using the information in the source, is to unpack what these experts are saying. We'll highlight the areas where agreement is remarkably strong.
Okay.
We'll delve into the debates, which can get quite nuanced and sometimes passionate, and we'll try to understand the different interpretive lenses scholars bring to the evidence.
All strictly based on the source material you shared.
That's the plan.
All right. So get ready to dive in. This is really where the rubber meets the road in historical analysis, isn't it? Okay, let's unpack this. So the source kicks us off stating something pretty remarkable right away. It says the death of Jesus Christ by crucifixion isn't just, important to Christianity.
No, it's way broader than that historically.
Right. It's a historical event that has garnered widespread and really intense attention from critical scholars for centuries. But the striking point it makes is the sheer level of agreement on the basic fact that the crucifixion happened. The source actually describes this agreement as exceptionally high.
Absolutely. It emphasizes that challenging the fact of Jesus' death by crucifixion is something, and I'm quoting here, exceptionally few critical scholars even bother to do today.
Exceptionally few. What do you mean?
Yeah. It's presented as virtually a given within the academic community. It's widely considered the best evidenced and most widely known aspect of the historical Jesus' life.
So like a cornerstone fact that serious historical research basically takes for granted now.
Pretty much, yeah. It's rarely, if ever, disputed in serious scholarship anymore.
And what's particularly interesting, based on how the source builds its case, is how it demonstrates this agreement. It doesn't just quote scholars you might expect to affirm it, based on their faith.
No, quite the opposite in some ways.
Right. The source purposely highlights comments from highly critical or even explicitly skeptical authors. It seems like it's doing that to make the point even stronger.
Exactly. It's like the source is saying, look, even the researchers who approach the New Testament and the historical Jesus with the highest degree of skepticism, the ones most likely to question traditional claims, still conclude that this event, the crucifixion, definitely happened.
That's a powerful way to frame it.
It is. By foregrounding scholars known for their critical methods, maybe their non-traditional views on Jesus, or even their non-Christian perspectives, the source really underscores just how robust the historical evidence for the crucifixion is considered.
So it elevates it to a very high level of historical certainty, even for those inclined to doubt other things.
Precisely. It shows this isn't just a belief held by insiders, but a conclusion reached across the board based on historical methodology.
Okay, let's look at some of the specific scholars mentioned in the source. Bart Ehrman, for instance. He's an atheist New Testament scholar, pretty well-known author.
Very well known, yes.
He calls the crucifixion the most certain element of the tradition about Jesus.
The most certain.
Yeah, he notes it's independently attested in a whole array of sources inside and outside the New Testament. And crucially, he adds, it's not the sort of thing that believers would want to make up.
That's the criterion of embarrassment, right?
Can you explain that a bit?
Sure. It's a standard tool in historical analysis. The basic idea is that if you find details in historical accounts that would have been awkward, embarrassing, or counterproductive for the early followers to promote, those details are less likely to have been invented later.
Because why invent something that makes your message harder to sell?
Exactly. And a crucified Messiah. That was profoundly offensive in the ancient world. It was seen as a cursed death, a sign of total failure and weakness. Early Christians were often ridiculed for worshiping a man executed like a common criminal or slave.
So Ehrman's point is, it's highly improbable they would have just made up such a central yet deeply problematic detail if it wasn't actually true.
Precisely. And John Dominic Crossan, who's often associated with the more, shall we say, liberal end of Jesus scholarship,
Right.
he echoes this certainty. He states the crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be.
As sure as anything historical can ever be. That's strong language.
It is. And he adds, he takes it absolutely for granted that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. That phrase, absolutely for granted, really tells you how settled he considers the issue.
Then there's Marcus Borg, another prominent figure often seen as having a more liberal approach. He agrees with Ehrman, calling it the most certain fact about the historical Jesus. And interestingly, he specifically frames it as Jesus' execution as a political rebel. So while Borg has a definite view on why it happened, focusing on that political angle,
Right, the interpretation of the reason might differ.
he doesn't dispute the fundamental what.
Yeah.
The execution itself is a given for him, too.
And this consensus isn't limited to scholars focused mainly on the New Testament. The source mentions Geza Vermes.
So yeah, the renowned Jewish historian.
Right. He wrote extensively on Jesus from a Jewish perspective. And he reports the crucifixion is hardly questionable.
Hardly questionable.
And one of the non-controversial facts concerning Jesus' life and activity, he also specifically mentions being crucified under Pontius Pilate. His view, coming from a different field and background, just adds another layer to how broad this agreement really is.
The source keeps going, citing James Tabor, who it describes as one of the more skeptical scholars surveyed.
Okay.
Tabor states, I think we need to have no doubt that given Jesus' execution by Roman crucifixion, he was truly dead. Now, his focus there is maybe more on the physical reality of death.
That crucifixion reliably resulted in death.
Right. But his starting point clearly accepts the crucifixion itself as historical certainty.
Yeah.
You don't discuss the result of an execution unless you accept the execution happened.
Good point. And then there's Elaine Pagels, known for her work on Gnosticism and other early Christian movements outside the usual canon.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
She notes that nearly all accounts about Jesus of Nazareth, whether written by persons hostile or devoted to him, agree on his condemnation and crucifixion by order of the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate C30.
So she's highlighting the consistency across different kinds of ancient sources, even hostile ones.
Exactly. Which, again, strengthens the historical credibility. If even your enemies report the same basic event, it's likely grounded in fact.
And Robert Funk, who's a co-founder of the Jesus Seminar, right? A group known for being pretty critical and often reaching skeptical conclusions.
That's right. They were known for their rigorous, sometimes controversial methods.
Yet Funk includes the crucifixion among the historical facts about Jesus considered common ground. He adds, the bare fact that Jesus was executed in Jerusalem on the authority of Pontius Pilate have stood up under close and repeated examination.
So even from a group specifically set up to question and reevaluate claims about Jesus, this basic fact stands firm.
And one more, Gerd Ludemann, another atheist New Testament scholar, cited. He allows that the fact of the death of Jesus as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable.
Indisputable. That's about as strong as it gets in historical inquiry, isn't it? It signals a level of certainty rarely achieved for ancient events.
Definitely. And the source then really underscores the power of citing these specific scholars. It notes that these examples of, well, pretty unanimous agreement come mostly from skeptical authors.
Right. It makes the point that if these scholars, known for their critical stance, show this level of unanimity,
Then imagine how many times you could multiply such comments from the vast majority of scholars across the entire spectrum, liberals, moderates, conservatives who also accept this.
it demonstrates, as the source notes, an overwhelming consensus. And just to round it out, the source mentions John Carroll and Joel Green, who wrote a detailed volume specifically on Jesus' death.
Okay.
They proclaim the crucifixion under Pilate is the most certain of all claims related to Jesus on what they call the continuum of historical probability.
So placing it at the absolute highest level of historical confidence.
It's exactly right at the top tier.
And the source ties this all back to that minimal facts methodology you mentioned earlier.
It does. The idea being that a historical event is considered really firmly grounded if it's established by multiple arguments.
Which this source mentions exploring elsewhere, noting something like 12 separate considerations.
Yes. It mentions a previous chapter lays out multiple independent lines of evidence for the crucifixion's historicity.
Okay, so multiple arguments
And it's agreed upon by the vast majority of critical scholars. This section clearly shows that second point, the broad scholarly consensus, including skeptics, is emphatically met for the crucifixion itself.
So the combined weight of diverse sources and near universal agreement among scholars is just incredibly powerful here.
It really is. The core fact of the crucifixion is remarkably well attested and accepted. It's the foundational point where the source begins its deep dive, highlighting its strength as a historical event considered virtually beyond dispute by researchers today.
It's presented as a solid cornerstone, really, for any further discussion about Jesus, no matter your perspective.
Exactly.
Okay, so the fact of the crucifixion is widely accepted, a historical given, pretty much a minimal fact. But figuring out when exactly it happened, that introduces a bit more complexity, doesn't it? Though the options still seem quite narrow.
Right. Pinpointing the exact date isn't usually considered a minimal fact in the same way the event itself is.
Why is that?
Well, dating often requires interpreting more variables, correlating different ancient calendars, maybe looking at astronomical data for Passover, dealing with sometimes sparse ancient records. There's just more room for interpretive differences.
Makes sense. More moving parts.
But the source does survey scholarly opinion on the date, and it reports that, by far, the majority of scholars think that the crucifixion of Jesus occurred in the spring of AD 30.
Okay, so even if it's not quite unanimous like the event itself, there's a strong majority leaning towards one specific year, AD 30.
That's what the source indicates, yes. A very strong preference for AD 30.
And it gives examples, showing the kind of historical detective work involved. Some scholars get very specific, like Thomas Sheehan and Hans Rudy Weber, proposing April 7th, AD 30.
Yeah, that level of precision is fascinating. It hints at the detailed calendar calculations based on things like lunar cycles and the known timing of Passover in that period.
But not everyone lands on such a precise date,
Yeah.
or they see other options as possible too.
Correct. The source mentions Raymond Brown, who was a hugely respected and widely cited scholar. He considered the most likely dates were either April 7th, AD 30, or April 3rd, AD 33.
So 30 or 33.
Right. And interestingly, despite all his work, Brown says he cannot choose between them. He literally writes, "I see no possibility of coming to a decision choosing one of the 2 years."
Wow, that really shows how the historical evidence, even when carefully weighed by experts, can sometimes point with equal force in slightly different directions.
It does. It highlights the limits of historical certainty sometimes.
John Meyer, known for his huge multi-volume work, A Marginal Jew, he opts for a date a week later in AD 30, suggesting April 14th. And the source lists a whole bunch of others who explicitly prefer AD 30. Names like Borg, Crossan, Funk in the Jesus Seminar, Pagels, Tabor, Hengel, Blumberg, Sloyan, Licona, Gorgian, and Bart Ehrman. That's a pretty substantial list.
It is. It represents a wide range of scholarly perspectives, all converging on AD 30.
Then there's E.P. Sanders. He computes various dates, but seems to land more generally.
Yeah, Sanders points out that most scholars are basically content to place the crucifixion somewhere between AD 29 and 33. He ultimately settles for approximately 30 as a good enough time frame.
And Dale Allison also acknowledges both 30 and 33 as the main option.
Yes, he recognizes both as the primary viable choices, sort of framing the debate around those 2 years, even if he might have his own preference. So even those who don't commit firmly to 80-30 still operate within that narrow 29-33 window, with 30 and 33 being the focal points.
But the source does note that 80-33 is the preferred date for some significant scholars. It mentions Harold Hoehner as one of the best-known scholars to opt for 80-33.
Right, along with respected historians Paul Barnett and Paul Mayer. So while 80-30 is clearly presented as the majority view in the source,
80-33 is definitely presented as the other significant viable option, supported by notable researchers, including Brown, who couldn't choose between them.
exactly. Hoehner's view, which is shared by many working on this, is basically that out of all the dates proposed over the centuries, only 80, 30, or 33 really remain plausible options that have strong historical arguments behind them today.
So it dramatically limits the possibilities that scholars seriously consider now, essentially down to two main contenders.
That seems to be the state of the discussion, according to this source.
So what are the reasons the source gives for scholars favoring one year over the other? How do they arrive at 30 or 33, and why the split?
Well, the source details some of the historical factors they weigh, often trying to connect Jesus' timeline to other known dates for key figures or events in the first century, like anchor points in history.
Okay, give me an example.
Paul Barnett, for instance, he points out key dates from historical texts. Tiberius became emperor in September AD 14. Then, according to Luke's Gospel, Luke 3.1, John the Baptist started his ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius's reign.
Okay, so doing the math. The 15th year starting from AD 14 would land us in AD 29.
Right. AD 29 is generally accepted as a pretty solid historical marker for when John the Baptist began his public activity.
So how does that connect to dating Jesus' crucifixion?
Well, if Jesus began his own preaching roughly around the same time as John, say in AD 29, then for scholars who opt for the AD 30 crucifixion date, it implies Jesus' public ministry lasted only about 1 full year, ending in the spring of 30.
Just 1 year. That seems potentially short based on the Gospels.
That's exactly the issue. This interpretation assumes Jesus started soon after John, and that the events described in the Gospels, like perhaps multiple Passover visits to Jerusalem mentioned in John's Gospel, can be compressed into that shorter time frame. Or maybe that John's Gospel isn't strictly chronological in that sense.
And is that the key factor that leads other scholars to prefer AD 33, the perceived length of the ministry?
Precisely. For those who interpret the Gospels, especially John's mentions of multiple Passovers, as implying Jesus' public ministry lasted longer than just 1 year, maybe 2 or even 3 years,
Okay.
then AD 33 becomes the only other really viable option that fits within the known time frame of Pontius Pilate's governorship. Pilate was governor from AD 26 to 36. So if Jesus started around 29 and ministered for, say, 3 years, then AD 33 fits that timeline much better than AD 30.
Right. 29 plus 3 years gets you to 32 or 33.
Okay.
How does this AD 33 idea fit with Paul's timeline? Because Paul's life is another crucial anchor point for dating early Christianity, isn't it?
Absolutely. Paul's chronology is key. According to the AD 33 crucifixion scenario, Paul would have had his conversion experience after the crucifixion, maybe around AD 34, 35. This conversion had to happen before AD 36 or 37, which is when the source notes Paul left Damascus. That departure is often correlated with other historical events, like when King Aretas V might have controlled Damascus, which helps scholars place Paul's early movements.
So these are external historical events scholars use to build a consistent framework.
Yes. The source mentions other dates too, like Emperor Claudius expelling Jews from Rome in AD 49, Paul likely arriving in Corinth in AD 50 for an 18-month stay, and Gallio's well-documented term as proconsul of Corinth from 51 to 52 AD. That Gallio inscription is a really firm anchor point for dating Paul's travels.
So these provide fixed points to try and map Paul's activities onto.
Exactly. And Barnett, for example, argues that this overall time frame, anchored by an AD 33 crucifixion, fits well with the 14 years Paul mentions in Galatians 2.1, the time between his conversion and a later trip to Jerusalem.
Okay.
On this calculation, Galatians might have been written only about 15 years after an AD 33 crucifixion, which some scholars find plausible within Paul's known life.
And Hoehner, the main proponent for AD 33 mentioned, he uses similar arguments.
Yes. According to the source, Hoehner brings in a number of considerations. He looks at astronomical calculations, likely related to Passover timing and lunar cycles. He looks at history, like the dates related to Pilate, Herod Antipas, and Tiberius, and he interprets the New Testament texts. Like Barnett, his view that Jesus' ministry lasted longer than a year is a major reason he favors AD 33.
Although the source notes, he admits ways to fit a 2-year ministry into an AD 30 timeframe too.
Yes, it mentions that Honer acknowledges ways to interpret the evidence for a slightly longer ministry that could still align with AD 30, which shows some flexibility even among proponents of one view.
He also brings in specific arguments about Pilate, Herod, and Tiberius for AD 33.
He does. The source mentions 3 specific historical arguments he makes related to these figures that he believes support AD 33. However, the source also adds a caveat, describing these particular arguments as not seeming very strong and being rather perspectival,
Implying they might rely heavily on specific interpretations or aren't as convincing to other scholars.
That seems to be the source's assessment, yes. Suggesting these points might not carry the same weight as, say, the arguments about ministry length or correlations with Paul's timeline.
Okay, so it sounds like scholars are pulling on various threads: gospel implications about ministry length, correlations with Roman history, Paul's known movements to land on either AD 30 or 33, with the length of ministry being a really significant factor driving the AD 33 argument.
Precisely. And the source wraps this up by noting Honer's bottom line, which it says is shared by many scholars working on this, is that really only AD 30 or 33 are plausible options today among all the dates ever proposed.
Which significantly narrows the field.
It does, and the source emphasizes there's no need to push the matter further, suggesting nothing hangs on absolute precision between these 2 dates for most historical or theological purposes. Knowing it was spring 30 or 33 is generally sufficient.
And for its own study, the source says it will follow the vast majority of recent scholars and just use AD 30 as the general working date.
Right. So this gives you, the listener, a really clear picture. While the exact day is debated, and scholars have detailed reasons rooted in history and texts for favoring 30 or 33, the consensus dramatically narrows it down to those 2 options. A strong majority leans 30, but 33 remains a significant, well-supported alternative. It's a great example of historical detective work.
Definitely, showing how interpreting complex data can lead to slightly different but closely related conclusions.
Yeah.
Okay, moving from the when to the how. This deep dive uses your source to explore what contemporary critical scholars say about the physical nature of crucifixion itself and the likely medical cause of Jesus' death.
Yeah, the brutal mechanics of it.
And the source mentions right off the bat that crucifixion was so heinous, so brutal, that ancient writers often just avoided describing the gory details.
That's a key point. It helps explain why finding detailed forensic accounts in ancient texts is rare. There was this reluctance, maybe born from sheer horror and the shame associated with it.
Which ironically made the early Christian message about a crucified Messiah even harder to accept back then.
Absolutely. The source calls it a difficult hurdle. Proclaiming a Messiah who died this shameful, tortured death was profoundly countercultural. It required a huge mental shift for both Jews and Gentiles. Worshipping someone executed this way was just scandalous.
And the source highlights a specifically Jewish perspective that added another layer of difficulty.
Yes. It references texts found at Qumran, like For Cupina, and scholarship from people like Fitzmyer, Carroll, and Green. They suggest that Jews often saw crucifixion as a form of hanging, mentioned back in Deuteronomy 21.
Okay, and what does Deuteronomy say about hanging?
That passage, Deuteronomy 21.22-23, states that anyone hanged on a tree is cursed by God. So from that perspective, crucifixion wasn't just physically agonizing, it was seen as a divinely cursed death.
Which would make accepting a crucified Messiah incredibly difficult for someone following Jewish law and tradition.
Immensely difficult. James D.G. Dunn is cited saying that today's Christian message about the cross has often been softened compared to that original context, where the death was seen as deeply offensive, cursed, and scandalous.
So despite this ancient reluctance to dwell on the details, what do scholars today understand about the mechanics of crucifixion based on historical and maybe medical knowledge?
Well, researchers piece together information from historical accounts, archaeological finds, and medical understanding of the body under extreme stress. They generally agree victims were most often nailed to various structures.
Like crosses, stakes, posts, trees.
Right. Sometimes maybe just boards or walls, though the source adds a note from Cook suggesting Romans probably didn't use boards or walls regularly. Martin Hengel, who wrote a major study on crucifixion, he cited stating that using nails was the norm, while tying victims was mentioned only rarely in the sources. So nailing seems to have been the standard Roman practice.
And the source points to concrete archaeological evidence supporting the use of nails.
It does. The discovery of the bones of Jehohanan back in 1968 is really critical here.
Tell me about Jehohanan.
He was a first-century crucifixion victim found in an ossuary, a bone box near Jerusalem. His bones showed direct physical evidence. One or more nails had been driven right through his heel bones.
Wow, direct evidence.
Yeah, and earlier reports on his bones also concluded he suffered crucifixion.
Crucifixion, that's the breaking of the legs.
Exactly, a practice sometimes used to hasten death during crucifixion, which we'll probably come back to.
And the source mentions other potential findings since then.
It notes more recent potential finds of other crucifixion victims that also seem to show nail evidence, but it adds a caution that more scientific work is needed to confirm those cases definitively. So the Jehohanan find, while maybe rare in its clarity, remains a really significant piece of direct archaeological evidence for nailing.
James Tabor, who we mentioned earlier, gives more detail on just how brutal the process itself was.
He does. As an archaeologist familiar with ancient practices, Tabor reports crucifixion was typically a very slow process. It could take as long as 2 or 3 days.
Days. That's horrific.
It is. And he concludes, reflecting the research consensus, that depending on the angle in which the arms and legs were nailed, death could be brought on more quickly or extended, deliberately prolonged. It highlights the slow, agonizing, intentionally torturous nature of it.
That paints a really grim, difficult picture.
Yeah.
So, given this understanding of the process, what was the ultimate physiological cause of death, according to the majority of critical scholars discussed in the source?
The source reports that the majority view among the critical scholars we're discussing here, just as it is among their medical colleagues who have studied this, is that Jesus probably died due to asphyxiation.
Asphyxiation, suffocation, essentially.
Yes. And the source notes pointedly that few other options even seem to be discussed in contemporary scholarship. This indicates asphyxiation is the strongly predominant conclusion.
So, the inability to breathe is identified as the main mechanism. How did that work?
Well, scholars describe it in detail. Tabor, for instance, explains death resulted from a combination of things: shock, exhaustion, muscle cramps, dehydration, blood loss. But finally, suffocation or perhaps heart failure resulting from the lack of oxygen.
Okay.
He elaborates on the suffocation part. Over time, as fatigue set in breathing became acutely difficult. Think about the position, arms extended, weight pulling down. It severely inhibits the ability to expand your chest and use your diaphragm for a full breath.
So just breathing becomes incredibly hard work.
Agonizingly hard.
Yeah.
To take a breath, the victim would have to push up with their legs or pull up with their arms, grinding against the nails. That motion becomes increasingly painful and eventually impossible as exhaustion takes over.
Carroll and Green offer a similar description.
Very similar. They say death came slowly, as the body surrendered to shock or to the painful process of asphyxiation, as the muscles used in breathing experienced paralysis brought on by fatigue. It's that exhaustion resulting paralysis of the respiratory muscles, the intercostals between the ribs, the diaphragm that makes effective breathing impossible.
Leading eventually to suffocation.
Yes.
And that Roman practice you mentioned, crucifixion, breaking the legs, that seems directly related to this mechanism.
Absolutely. Crossan also mentions the breaking of ankles or legs as something the Romans did specifically to hasten death. He explains that breaking the legs rendered breathing impossible so that one died swiftly of asphyxiation or shock.
Because they couldn't push up anymore to get a breath.
Exactly. By breaking the legs, you prevented the victim from pushing up to relieve the pressure on their chest, accelerating the suffocation process. Crossan even illustrates this with an account of the Apostle Andrew's martyrdom, where the executioner supposedly avoided breaking his legs or even using nails, precisely to prolong his suffering. This shows the ancients understood how these actions affected breathing and the duration of the agony.
N.T. Wright and Fienne Perkins also confirm this point about leg breaking.
Yes, Wright states concisely, when crucified people had their legs broken, they died very quickly from asphyxiation. And Perkins reports, it was customary to hasten the death by suffocation of a crucified person by breaking his legs. This consistency across different scholars really reinforces the link between the body's posture on the cross, exhaustion, the inability to breathe, and crucifixion as a way to speed up death by suffocation.
And Zias and Sekles, who might have been involved with the Jehohanan find or related medical studies.
They also explicitly point to asphyxiation. They state death by crucifixion was obviously incredibly painful and was caused by asphyxiation due to the effects that hanging had on the intercostal and diaphragm muscles, pinpointing those key respiratory muscles. The source also lists Sloyan, Gorgon, and Weber as others agreeing on asphyxiation.
So the inability to breathe effectively as the body tired and sagged, requiring that agonizing effort for each breath, seems to be the central physiological mechanism identified by the overwhelming majority of these scholars.
Precisely. While they acknowledge other factors were definitely involved, shock, exhaustion, dehydration, blood loss, as mentioned by Crossan, Tabor, Carroll, and Green, Weber asphyxiation is seen as the most central factor that ultimately caused death on the cross. It's a complex physiological cascade resulting directly from the specific torture of crucifixion.
Did the source mention any significant alternative views on the cause of death that are still actively discussed?
It does note that Raymond Brown, in his survey of medical sources, included a comment about pathologist Frederick Zugib. Zugib's research apparently came to different conclusions and opposed the asphyxiation findings.
Okay, so there is a dissenting view noted.
Yes, but the source immediately adds, importantly, that Zugib's findings were also opposed by others, particularly other medical researchers. This suggests that while views like Zugib's exist, they don't represent the broad consensus among either the critical scholars surveyed here or the wider medical community studying crucifixion.
Okay, so this gives us a really clear, albeit grim, picture from the source. Drawing on history, texts, archaeology, and medical understanding, the overwhelming scholarly consensus points to asphyxiation as the primary cause of death during crucifixion. It resulted from the physical ordeal, the exhaustion of respiratory muscles, though other factors contributed to the agony. Understanding this brutal reality seems crucial for appreciating the historical event itself.
It definitely grounds the discussion in a very harsh physical reality.
Right. Which brings us to a question that sparks, well, significant debate among critical scholars. Why was Jesus executed? What were the primary reasons leading to his condemnation and crucifixion?
Yes, the why question.
The source says this is one of the most interesting parts of the contemporary dialogue because it really highlights how scholarly viewpoints often seem to, quote, line up along party lines.
This is where, as the source puts it, those worldview proclivities we talked about earlier become particularly apparent. They seem to really influence how scholars interpret the historical data regarding motivation and significance.
Okay, so the source presents two main poles of interpretation within critical scholarship on this why question. What's the first one? The sort of classic or more conservative view.
The source states the classic response, often favored by more conservative or even somewhat moderate commentators, is that Jesus primarily offended the Jewish leaders for fundamentally religious reasons. The core charge that led to his condemnation by the Jewish authorities in this view was ultimately blasphemy.
So this view centers the conflict on Jesus' identity claims and how they clashed with the Jewish religious context of the time.
Exactly. It's about what he said about himself and God and how that was perceived.
And the source points to a specific text in the Gospels as the key evidence for this fear.
Yes, it highlights the account in Mark 14, specifically verses 61 to 64. This is the scene where Jesus is on trial before the Jewish high priest and the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council.
Well, what a trial scene.
Witnesses are brought, but their testimony is inconsistent. So the high priest takes over and asks Jesus directly, point blank, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?"
A direct question about his identity. And Jesus' response in that text is seen as the pivotal moment.
It is. For this interpretation, Jesus responds with a striking affirmation. I am, ego eimi in the Greek, which can carry significant weight. But then he goes further, adding this powerful proclamation, quote, "You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven."
Okay, let's break that down. Son of Man, sitting at the right hand, coming on the clouds. What's the significance there?
Well, he's combining imagery from two key Old Testament texts. Daniel 7 describes a Son of Man figure receiving authority and coming on clouds. And Psalm 110:10 speaks of someone being seated at God's right hand, a position of ultimate divine authority and power.
So by combining these, Jesus is seemingly placing himself in a position of unique, almost divine authority and future judgment over the very leaders judging him.
That's how many scholars holding this view interpret it. He's making an extraordinary claim about his status and role in relation to God.
And the immediate reaction in the text.
The high priest tears his robes, cries, "Blasphemy!" and the council unanimously condemns him as deserving death according to Jewish law based on that statement.
But what specifically about his statement was seen as blasphemous, according to the scholars who hold this view?
Raymond Brown, for example, sees Jesus claiming to be the apocalyptic Son of Man who would sit at God's right hand as going too far for the Jewish leaders. It revealed, in their eyes, arrogant intentions infringing on divine prerogatives, claiming that cosmic role was stepping into God's unique domain.
And the part about sitting at God's right hand seems particularly key for some.
Yes, that specific image from Psalm 110 applied to himself in Mark 14.62 is highlighted by several scholars. Evans argues that when Jesus declared he'd sit at God's right hand, Jesus anticipated sharing God's chariot throne.
Sharing God's throne.
Yeah. Evans says such a claim would have been scandalous, for the idea of a mortal sitting on God's throne was unthinkable within strict Jewish monotheism. He concludes this specific claim surely prompted the blasphemy charge.
And T. Wright makes a similar point.
He does. Wright thinks that by combining Daniel 7 and Psalm 110, Jesus might also be echoing themes found in 1 Enoch, a Jewish apocalyptic work from around that time. He sees this combination as an extraordinary claim by Jesus to an enthronement in which the Messiah, or the Son of Man, would share the very throne of Israel's God.
So not just claiming to be the Messiah, but claiming a divine-level authority and unique relationship with God.
That's the argument. Whittington adds Psalm 80.17 to this mix, calling it a creative conglomerate. Jesus deliberately combined to produce a definite enthronement theme, positioning himself alongside God. Darrell Bach, who the source notes studied this passage extensively, reaches a conclusion quite close to Evans, Wright, and Witherington, strongly supporting the view that these high claims about his identity were the direct trigger for the blasphemy charge.
So from this perspective presented in the source, Jesus' profound, maybe provocative claims about himself and his role, linking himself closely with God's own authority, were the primary reason the Jewish leaders condemned him based on their religious law.
Right, and the source explicitly links this view to scholars who accept a high Christology. The idea that the historical Jesus himself made claims suggesting his own divine or near-divine status, not just that the church attributed it to him later.
Okay. They feel they're following the evidence in texts like Mark 14.
Correct. But the source then points out a crucial next step, that those focusing only on the religious charge sometimes overlook or downplay.
Which is?
The Romans. The Romans were the ones who actually carried out the execution by crucifixion. And the Romans, generally speaking, didn't care much about internal Jewish theological debates, except when those debates spilled over and potentially threatened Roman order or authority.
Ah, okay. So the Jewish charge of blasphemy needed to be translated into something the Romans would act upon.
Exactly. Which leads us to the second main perspective presented in the source regarding why Jesus died.
And this is the more liberal perspective mentioned.
Generally associated with more liberal theological or historical viewpoints, yes. This group often emphasizes only that Jesus was perceived by the authorities, particularly the Roman authorities, as a political rebel, someone who posed a definite danger to the state. Their focus shifts to the Roman concern for maintaining civil order and control in occupied Judea.
Okay, and the source cites scholars holding this view too.
Yes. John Dominic Crossan, whom we heard from earlier, refers to his understanding of Jesus as a peasant revolutionary, though he qualifies it as radically social rather than an aggressively military one. Still, even a social revolutionary could easily be seen as politically disruptive by an occupying power.
Makes sense.
Marcus Borg, as we noted, states the most certain fact is Jesus' execution as a political rebel. Elsewhere, he attributes the death to Jesus being perceived by Romans as a political threat to Roman order. For Borg and others like him, this political threat is the primary, maybe exclusive, lens.
Robert Funk from the Jesus Seminar even suggested multiple political reasons.
He did. Funk thought Jesus might have been executed summarily as a threat to public order during the volatile Passover season, or maybe as a pretender to the Davidic throne, a direct political claim challenging Rome, or even for his hostile act directed against the temple, since the temple had political and economic ties to Roman administration.
So different potential political angles.
Right. Richard Horsley, who focuses heavily on the social and political context, states, Jesus was clearly condemned to crucifixion as a figure whom the Roman authority found politically dangerous, actually, or potentially disruptive of the Roman order. And E.P. Sanders just states simply Jesus was crucified as an insurgent.
This view really emphasizes the Roman role as executioners, driven by their need for stability and preventing rebellion, not by Jewish theological disputes.
Exactly. And the source points to how the narrative shifts when Jesus is brought before Pilate. The religious charge had to be reframed. It references John 18.31, where the Jewish leaders tell Pilate, We have no right to execute anyone, pushing it into Roman jurisdiction. And John 19.12, where the crowd pressures Pilate by shouting that releasing Jesus means he's no friend of Caesar's, directly linking Jesus to a challenge against the emperor himself. That's the ultimate political threat from Rome's perspective.
So this perspective sees the Roman action as driven purely by political necessity and demonstrating loyalty to Caesar, not by any religious judgment.
That's the core of this view. It highlights the gap between the likely Jewish charge, blasphemy, and the Roman punishment, crucifixion, typically for state offenses like rebellion.
Okay, so we have these two main viewpoints presented. Religious blasphemy causing Jewish condemnation versus political threat causing Roman execution. The source then tries to analyze why scholars divide so sharply on this, linking it back to those worldview proclivities.
It does. It suggests scholars often approach this with seemingly airtight categories, focusing almost exclusively on one angle and downplaying the other.
And it offers a specific speculation about why some liberal commentators might lean heavily towards the purely political explanation.
Yes, it speculates, and it stresses its speculation, that for some liberal scholars, they respect Jesus so much that they cannot deal with him having made any high Christological pronouncements, let alone being mistaken in so doing.
Meaning, the idea that the historical Jesus genuinely claimed divine or near-divine status is difficult for them to accept, so they prefer an explanation that avoids it.
That seems to be the suggestion, that attributing such high claims to the historical Jesus himself is problematic for their view of him, perhaps as primarily a human ethical teacher or social reformer.
That's a really interesting, almost psychological observation about potential scholarly motivations.
It is. The source even asks why these scholars, if they think Jesus was mistaken about high claims, wouldn't just say, well, the evidence suggests he made these claims, but he was wrong, like they might argue about other aspects of his teaching.
Implying there's a unique resistance to even attributing the claims to him in the first place.
Perhaps a resistance possibly driven by a desire to present a Jesus figure more aligned with modern, secular, or humanitarian ideals. So characterizing the whole conflict in purely political terms becomes a more comfortable explanation as it sidesteps the issue of Jesus's potentially offensive high self-claims.
The source also includes a counter-argument against interpretations that portray Jesus too mildly, suggesting such a figure wouldn't provoke crucifixion.
Right. It quotes Craig Blomberg asking, essentially, would anyone, Jewish or Roman authorities, have sentenced someone like the Jesus, sometimes portrayed by the Jesus Seminar, described as a cynic philosopher, societal critic, and gadfly without much of a specific religious message, to death?
Let alone death by crucifixion, which was extreme.
Exactly. Crucifixion was reserved for serious offenses, usually those threatening the established order. Would they execute someone just for being an irritating philosopher?
James D.G. Dunn makes a similar point regarding Crossan's view.
Yes. Dunn asks Crossan if his peasant revolutionary Jesus isn't maybe far too nice to be worth crucifying. He links this kind of portrayal to earlier attempts in the 19th century to find a purely human Jesus by stripping away the challenging theological elements. The point is, a figure who seems relatively harmless doesn't seem to adequately explain the extreme severity of the punishment.
The source itself asks directly, if scholars favor an egalitarian, tolerant, sort of politically correct Jesus, can they explain why that kind of figure would be killed? Who kills someone for being a liberated fine fellow?
It's a provocative question. It strongly suggests, from the source's perspective, that the reasons for the crucifixion must have been perceived as much more seriously disruptive or threatening religiously, politically, or both than some simplified interpretations allow. The severity of the execution implies a corresponding severity in the perceived offense.
So given these two seemingly opposing camps, religious versus political, the source argues for a more integrated understanding.
It does. It argues that both of the major positions are correct regarding a portion of the overall picture. Attempts to see it from only one exclusive angle are likely incomplete.
Okay, so looking back at the first angle, the conservative one focusing on the religious charge, what does the source see as correct there?
Well, from that perspective, which the source suggests was likely the primary concern of the Jewish leaders according to the Gospels, Jesus did make many explicit and implicit comments regarding what could only been taken as a very high view of himself.
The high claims we discussed earlier.
Right. Claims about his identity and authority that certainly would have been outrageous and offensive had they not been true. Questions like, was he the Son of God, the Son of Man in that exalted sense, going to sit on God's throne? The source explicitly states that based on the evidence like Mark 14, it seems many Jews found his teaching to be highly blasphemous, despite any counter-arguments. It leans strongly towards accepting that Jesus made high claims that led to the blasphemy charge.
But the liberal angle, focusing on the political threat, also captures a vital part of the truth.
Yes. From that angle, Jesus' ministry certainly exhibited some political overtones. Now, the source clarifies political here doesn't necessarily mean Jesus wanted to run for office or be a literal king.
Okay.
Rather, it means recognizing that anyone who could gather huge crowds, especially a charismatic figure reputedly performing miracles and commanding intense loyalty, that person would inevitably be seen as politically dangerous by the Roman occupiers.
Especially given the context.
Absolutely. The Romans were constantly paranoid about potential unrest or challenges to their rule. This was even more true for a compelling figure attracting large followings.
And the timing and location Passover in Jerusalem amplified this Roman sensitivity.
Massively. Passover brought huge crowds, potentially filled with nationalistic fervor and anti-Roman sentiment, into a confined space. Any popular figure capable of mobilizing people was a potential spark for rebellion in that tense environment. So even if the Jewish leaders' primary concern was religious blasphemy,
They likely presented Jesus to Pilate as a political threat. A king pretender, an instigator of unrest, because that's the charge the Romans would understand and act upon decisively.
exactly, that's the likely dynamic. The religious offense leads to the Jewish desire for condemnation, but it gets translated into political terms to secure the Roman execution.
So the source concludes it wasn't just one thing, but a multifaceted issue. It involved both Jesus' profound religious claims leading to the blasphemy charge and his actions and popularity being perceived as politically disruptive by Rome, especially in that volatile Passover context.
Right. It argues that attempts to see it from only one angle miss the interwoven religious and political dynamics. It even mentions other factors, like how someone healed by Jesus would view him very differently from a religious leader he challenged, showing how personal perspectives also played a role.
That complexity seems crucial. The source emphasizes the why is debated, often along lines influenced by worldview proclivities, but a comprehensive view needs to incorporate both the religious challenge of Jesus' claims and the political threat his movement represented to the authorities.
It paints a much richer, more complex picture of the factors leading to the cross.
Okay, this brings us to the final section covered in the source. It moves beyond the historical facts and the immediate reasons for the execution, and delves into a key question about the significance of Jesus' death.
Right, the meaning behind it.
Specifically, the question is, did Jesus himself understand his own death as being a substitutionary sacrifice or an atoning payment for sins? This gets into Jesus' own consciousness and theological understanding.
And according to the source, this question reveals another huge gulf in interpretation, again, splitting between more conservative plus some moderate critical scholars and their more liberal and skeptical colleagues.
Another area where those worldview proclivities seem to play a major role.
That's what the source strongly suggests, yes. How scholars answer this question seems heavily influenced by their broader theological or philosophical frameworks.
So how do the liberal and skeptical scholars typically view this question according to the source? Did Jesus think his death was an atonement?
The source notes these scholars frequently find these notions, substitutionary sacrifice, paying for sins, to be simply appalling from a modern ethical standpoint.
Appalling, that's strong.
It is. The source even says they sometimes label the idea child abuse, or state as philosophically impossible that one person's sacrifice could pay for another's sin. This indicates a strong prior ethical or philosophical objection to the concept itself, which then shapes their reading of the historical texts.
Okay, so how does that play out in their interpretation? Like Marcus Borg, for example.
Borg is presented as acknowledging the historical fact that the central emphasis on the unique achievement of Jesus' death as the sin offering was undeniably at the center of early Christian thought. He sees it clearly in the New Testament.
So he admits the early church saw it that way.
Yes, he acknowledges its centrality for the early community. However, he explicitly states he does not think that it was Jesus' own teaching. He also specifically rejects N.T. Wright's view that Jesus himself saw his death as central in this atoning way.
So for Borg, The atonement idea originates after Jesus within the community reflecting on his death.
Exactly. Borg lists 5 meanings he finds for the death-resurrection pattern in the New Testament: rejection, vindication, defeating evil powers, revealing the way, revealing God's love, and sacrifice for sin, atonement. He says these make sense as the product of the early community, central to their proclamation, but then reiterates none of these, including atonement, were central to Jesus' own teaching or understanding. It's a post-Jesus development.
Gerard Sloyan agrees with Borg on this.
The source cites Sloyan as holding a similar view. He believes that, based on the evidence we have, Paul was the earliest writer to construe Jesus' death as expiating human sin and sinfulness.
Implying it starts, or is first clearly articulated, with Paul.
Yes. And Sloyan crucially states, "We just do not know what either earlier Christians or Jesus thought on the subject." This perspective argues there's just not enough clear evidence to trace the atonement teaching back to Jesus or his immediate contemporaries. It's seen mainly as a later theological development, perhaps codified by Paul.
So the position of these scholars, as presented, is that the idea of Jesus' death being an atoning sacrifice emerged after Jesus within the early church, maybe beginning or solidifying with Paul.
That's the core of that view. But the source immediately contrasts this sharply with the position of conservatives and some moderates.
What's their view?
They locate it regularly in Jesus' own teachings. The source finds it amazing that some commentators, like Borg and Sloyan, seem unable to find this teaching in Jesus' words or the earliest traditions, while others, including highly respected researchers, readily do and find strong evidence for it.
Okay, so who are some of the scholars mentioned who do trace the atonement teaching back to Jesus, and what their evidence?
The source presents a strong countercase from several scholars. Martin Hengel, a towering figure in the study of early Christianity and Judaism, he directly objects to Borg's and Sloyan's assertions that we don't know what Jesus thought. Hengel argues forcefully that the Christian message about a crucified Messiah uniquely broke apart the customary conceptions of atonement in the ancient world.
How so?
He argues the Christian view was unique in being universal, seen as performed by God himself and linked to the end times, the coming kingdom. Because this view is so central and unique in the earliest Christian message, Hengel asserts a methodological principle.
Okay.
He says, methodologically, then, we are justified, indeed compelled, to push our inquiry back to Jesus himself. He thinks it should no longer be doubted that he reckoned with the possibility of his own execution, a violent death.
So Hengel thinks Jesus anticipated his death.
Yes, and not just anticipated it, but intended it to have meaning. Hengel concludes, based on the evidence, Jesus wanted to prepare the way for the coming of the kingdom of God through his sacrificial death. For Hengel, Jesus wasn't passive. He actively saw his death as sacrificial and key to God's plan.
And does Hengel point to specific texts, specific words of Jesus to support this?
Yes.
You mentioned explicit formulae.
Yes. That's a key part of Hengel's argument. He believes he finds explicit formulae in the Gospels where Jesus' own words indicate this understanding. The 2 primary examples cited are Mark 10.45,
Which says,
"The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." That word ransom directly implies substitution or payment.
okay, and the other.
Mark 14.24 from the Last Supper narrative, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." Again, blood of the covenant poured out strongly evokes sacrificial and atoning imagery from the Old Testament.
Finding these as explicit formulae seems important. What does that imply?
The source explains that arguing for formula suggests these weren't just casual remarks. It implies the earliest church, right after Jesus' death, remembered and structured these key sayings into fixed, memorable, creedal-like statements for easy oral transmission.
So they're like little summaries of core beliefs.
Exactly. And Hengel argues this process of formulation probably goes back to the pre-Pauline period, before Paul wrote his letters. So for Hengel, the content, death as ransom sacrifice, originates with Jesus, while the formulation into these transmissible sayings happened very early in the church.
And the source connects one of these, Mark 14.24 from the Last Supper, to Paul's writings to strengthen the case for it being extremely early.
It does, and this is highlighted as powerful evidence. The early formula in Mark 14.24 is closely paralleled by Paul's citation of another very early pre-Pauline tradition about the Last Supper in 1 Corinthians 11.23-26.
Okay, Paul quotes an earlier tradition there.
Yes. Paul explicitly says he received this tradition about the bread and cup from the Lord, meaning from the authoritative tradition tracing back to Jesus, and that he received it earlier than when he wrote 1 Corinthians. around 50 or 51 AD. The source states critical scholars almost uniformly hold that Paul is here citing a creedal tradition that extends back to the very earliest church.
Meaning it was circulating before Paul wrote, very early on.
Yes. The source quotes scholar Ulrich Wilkins saying about this material indubitably goes back to the oldest phase of all in the history of primitive Christianity. That indicates a strong consensus, even among critical scholars, that Paul is passing on something from the very beginning, very shortly after the events, not inventing it himself decades later.
And the source mentions another Pauline text, often linked to these early traditions about Jesus' death.
Yes, 1 Corinthians 15:3-8. This is another foundational text widely considered by scholars to be another extremely early pre-Pauline creedal tradition that Paul says he received.
And scholars date this one very early, too.
Often to the early 30s AD. Perhaps within just a few years of the crucifixion itself. And this creed explicitly states that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures and was buried and raised.
So that directly links his death to atonement for sins, right in this very early creed.
Explicitly. So the argument from these scholars, as presented in the source, is that Paul wasn't inventing the idea of Jesus dying for sins. He was citing much earlier traditions, potentially rooted in Jesus' own words, like Mark 10.45 and 14.24, which were already circulating as core beliefs in the earliest Christian community right from the start.
Okay, so even if we only had Paul's letters citing these traditions from the early 30s,
we'd still know the atonement concept predates Paul's writing by maybe 1 or 2 decades, pushing it very close to Jesus' time. When you combine that with what Hengel and others see as Jesus' own explicit teaching in Mark 10.45 and 14.24.
the source argues it builds a strong case.
Yes, it concludes these 4 texts from Paul and Mark combine to make a seemingly insurmountable case for the pre-Pauline teaching of Jesus' sacrificial death, as well as a strong case for tracing that doctrine back to Jesus himself.
That does sound like a powerful argument, presented in the source, for the idea having very early origins, potentially in Jesus' own understanding. Who else supports this view, according to the source?
It lists several others who seem to agree with or support Hengel's assessment, representing a significant stream of critical scholarship. Jürgen Moltmann, the prominent theologian. He affirms that vicarious atonement comes from very early in Christianity, with Christ's death central. G.B. Caird notes that while sacrifice might seem foreign to us now, for Jesus, however, sacrifice was a vital concept, suggesting Jesus operated within that framework.
Yeah.
Ben Meyer argues Jesus offered numerous clues, and that the expiatory motif, making amends for sin, in the ransom word, Mark 10.45, and the Eucharistic words, Mark 14.24, points to Jesus seeing his death as the solution to sin and death.
Joel Collins also weighs in.
Strongly. O'Collins states Jesus did think of his death as a saving event, and the pre-Pauline traditions abundantly indicate his crucifixion was a death for us, which representatively atoned for human sin. He believes the doctrine goes back to Jesus himself and even breaks down different levels of meaning in died for others found in the early texts.
And Paul Barnett, who we heard from on dating.
Yes, Barnett, like Hengel and O'Collins, states quite clearly that the very best way to account for the importance and centrality of these atonement ideas in the earliest church is that Jesus himself was the originator of these teachings. The historical argument is its early centrality is best explained by it coming from Jesus himself.
So to sum up this point, while many liberal scholars see atonement as a later church development, a significant group of influential critical scholars, cited here, find strong evidence in the sources like Paul's citation of early creeds and specific sayings attributed to Jesus for tracing this idea of an intentionally sacrificial, atoning death back to Jesus himself and the very earliest moments of Christianity.
That's the clear divergence presented in the source on the significance of the death. It concludes by reiterating that understanding the significance depends heavily on which scholarly option you lean towards, the conservative moderate view tracing it to Jesus, or the liberal skeptical view seeing it as later.
But it emphasizes the idea itself was definitely central very early on.
Yes, it states it's clearly the case that the idea of atoning death was central in the very earliest church, thanks to those pre-Pauline creeds from the early 30s. And, as we heard, numerous authors argue persuasively that the best explanation for that early centrality is that the idea originated beyond the creeds, with Jesus himself.
Okay, that gives a really good sense of the debate on significance.
So this deep dive, really guided by the source you provided, has given us a pretty comprehensive overview of how contemporary critical scholars approach the death of Jesus by crucifixion.
Yeah, we've seen that on the basic historical fact of the event, There's an incredible amount of unanimity, right? Even among the skeptics. That's why it's considered a minimal fact.
Exactly, a foundational point of agreement.
We looked at the date, seeing the consensus narrows dramatically to AD 30 or 33, and we understood the historical arguments behind those, relating to ministry length and external anchors like Paul or Roman history.
Complex historical reconstruction there.
We explored the brutal physical reality of how he died, with asphyxiation being the strong consensus among scholars, based on understanding the agony of crucifixion and practices like leg breaking.
Supported by that archaeological find of Jehohanan, too.
Right. And then we delved into those more debated, maybe more interesting questions of why Jesus was executed and the significance of his death.
Yeah, where we saw scholars often align along theological or philosophical lines, leading to different interpretations of the same core texts.
We saw the differing views on whether he was condemned primarily for religious blasphemy based on high claims, or seen mainly as a political threat by Rome, and how the source argued for a comprehensive view needing both angles.
Right, how the religious charge likely morphed into a political one before Pilate.
And we examined the debate on whether Jesus himself understood his death as atoning, or if that emerged later. We heard the strong case presented by scholars like Hengel for tracing it back to Jesus' own teaching and those very early pre-polling traditions.
Citing Mark 10.45, 14.24, and those crucial creeds in 1 Corinthians 11 and 15.
Exactly. Now, the source makes a pointed observation right at the end, bringing us back to those questions of why and significance.
Yeah, it emphasizes that while the historicity of the event is settled, the answers to why it happened and what it meant largely depended on the theological inclinations of the respondents.
It states quite directly, maybe even provocatively, that in these areas dealing with meaning and motivation, worldview proclivities often trump the facts.
That's a strong claim. It suggests a scholar's pre-existing beliefs or framework can heavily influence how they weigh and interpret the data, especially when moving beyond simple historical occurrence to intention and significance. It really highlights the challenge of objectivity with deeply meaningful events.
It does. And it mentions that recent studies on early Christology, how Jesus' identity was understood right from the start, have apparently given a huge boost to the conservative aspects of these questions.
Meaning more support for the idea that Jesus did perceive himself in high terms, maybe divine terms, and understood his death accordingly.
That seems to be the implication, that recent scholarship is perhaps shifting the landscape a bit, lending more weight to interpretations tracing high Christology and atonement ideas back to Jesus himself.
Interesting. It shows these debates are ongoing and can evolve based on new research.
Absolutely. This deep dive, guided by your source, really shows the detailed, often passionate analysis happening in scholarship on this event. It highlights the need to look at multiple perspectives, the evidence they use, and also be aware of how interpretive frameworks those worldview proclivities can shape the conclusions.
It certainly does. It paints a picture where some facts are rock solid, but interpreting their cause and meaning remains a vibrant, complex area of debate influenced by both evidence and perspective. It definitely leaves you, the listener, with a lot to think about.
So here's a final thought for you to mull over, drawing from what we've explored in your sources today. The source presents a compelling case, using multiple scholars, that there's strong evidence suggesting Jesus made very high claims about his identity, potentially seeing himself in divine terms. It suggests these claims, along with his actions, were central to why he was crucified, and that he himself viewed his death as having profound, possibly atoning significance.
Tracing those ideas back to Jesus and the earliest traditions.
Right. So given those scholarly arguments, what does it make you wonder about that relationship between a scholar's personal perspective, their worldview proclivities, and how they interpret historical evidence? Especially when the evidence might point towards conclusions about ancient figures or events that really challenge modern sensibilities, our ethical frameworks, or existing beliefs. How easy is it to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it's uncomfortable?
And related to that, does the source's provocative point about a nice, purely ethical Jesus perhaps being insufficient to explain the sheer brutality of the crucifixion? Does that resonate with you? When you consider the different scholarly explanations for why he died, does the extreme nature of the punishment itself imply a perceived threat, whether religious or political, that must have gone far beyond just being a gentle teacher or social critic? What kind of figure does get crucified?
Lots to think about there. Thank you for sharing the sources that made this deep dive possible. We really hope it's given you a deeper understanding of the complex, fascinating landscape of contemporary critical scholarship on this pivotal historical event, showing both the remarkable certainties and the significant areas of ongoing debate.